Ah, sim. Aí eu ligava.
Boa tarde a todos e todas. Vamos ter o nosso segundo palestrante do dia, que é o professor David. O professor David é americano, professor emérito da University of Pennsylvania, e é o International Dean, or Dean for something international, Southeast University em Nanjing. Ele é um agente do Brasil-China. Brasil-China, USA-China. Bom, além de ser professor emérito, etc., é um reputado prestigioso escolar, autor de vários livros, particularmente interessado nas questões da temporalidade sobre a arquitetura. Enfim, um bom menino. Quer dizer, é um bom menino, mas na verdade, vamos dizer, um menino rebelde também, porque há sim o nosso amigo José Maria aqui, ele não acatou as minhas sugestões. As minhas sugestões é para um se concentrasse no valor histórico e o outro no valor artístico, mas segundo uma certa linha. E eles insistem como meninos levados em fazer o que eles querem. E assim o mesmo aconteceu com o dele. Eu tinha pedido para ele para falar do valor artístico, para centrar nas questões da beleza, da cultura como arte e da beleza, mas ele anunciou que vai falar sobre ficção. O que eu posso fazer? Dele, pode ir.
It's a great pleasure. Really, it's hard for me to convey how great a pleasure it is to be back in Porto Alegre. I like the city and the university, but especially friends that I have here, friends from other cities who happen to have comments. It's not easy to express what a pleasure it is to be here, and also gratitude to so many who've come, because though a really wonderful conference, it's also been long, and I'm happy that you're here. But I don't want to overstate myself, because it's also, I must say, a little bit problematic, because I haven't been spared the instructions from Professor Comas. I was also given marching orders, and this evil genius, who is my friend, gave me a particularly difficult assignment. He said that I should address history and heritage and the value that we expect of its achievements. But he said, David, don't explain the importance of the buildings you discuss by contextualizing them, by historicizing them. Comas wanted me to talk about historical buildings without history. That's not easy. I'll try. And the double difficulty is that he then told me the title of this conference, Future of the Past. I thought it was how can I be, the past is past, the future is, that's no longer, the future is not yet. And neither of them bear directly on what concerns us most now. So from the beginning, I must say I was puzzled by Comas's instructions. And all that I have for you tonight is an attempt to think through that puzzle. Small little question, the relationship between past and future within the scope of an architectural project. My aim is to present a two-part presentation. This happens to be the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia by Paul Philippe Gray, roughly 1930. First, I'll describe architecture as an art. That's hardly a newsflash. It's probably pretty obvious to make such an assertion. But because the term is used very widely, and I think too inclusively, tonight I'll define it more narrowly. I'd like you to, I hope you will think with me about architecture as a practice of producing fictions or fabrications. That's part one. Part two, and with the title of the conference in mind, I'd like to show that this art unfolds in a particular temporality, known generally in architecture as, we call it the time of the project. Tonight I'll characterize it as a conjunction of times now plus then. I'll describe it as time out of time, particularly when the latter is understood as uniformly sequential. what we commonly call clock time. You may know that when Cray designed this building, he had in mind Rodin's studio outside of Paris, and in fact rebuilt the gate and front facade of the Parisian Rodin studio in Philadelphia. And you see the back of that false front here. I imagine it will not be controversial to say that architectural works are fabricated. But when we agree to the assertion that buildings are made, probably few will anticipate what tonight I'll suggest, that buildings are made up the way stories are. That the two, stories and spaces, are sibling fictions, which is to say that as arts, they disclose realities that do not exist and perhaps never did. Realities here obviously refers to contents that exceed the objectively present without excluding it. Architectural construction is obviously productive. New buildings are added to or transformed out of the urban and rural topographies that we occupy every day, generally to satisfy previously unmet needs. Here's an opening question. Can it be said that, like stories, buildings are not only additive and need satisfying, but bring before us representations of what we desire, but know may never exist, fabricating reality in both senses of the word? If it can be seen this way, I believe architecture should be understood as one example of what the philosopher Nelson Goodman called ways of world making. The world of Homer, Shakespeare, Proust, Borges. Those are worlds that we live in, at least imaginatively. Might architecture be seen similarly? I'll make my case in 3 steps. Preceding the 2 I've mentioned, discussions of constructed fiction and project time, I'll begin with an introductory third. It'll be an etymological preamble to define the vocabulary I use, and I should apologize at the outset for the schoolmaster character of my opening. This is a COVID shot, you probably would have guessed. Fiction, like the English word feign, derives from Latin figura, fingere, which meant to model in clay, fashioning or forming a pliable plastic material. You could say that the brick and mortar are plastic and the result is a fiction in this old sense of the word. Subsequently, the meaning was associated with mental as well as manual and material work. The invisible but still productive labor of inventing, imagining, and pretending. Feign gives a comparable sense of constructed appearance, but that word generally means in English contrived to trick. A narrow application of the word fiction indicates a prose work of the imagination that is either indifferent to, sometimes in defiance of, reality. The aim of fiction in this sense, would be to entertain, instruct, sometimes to deceive. The first 2 fictional, the third fictitious. But fiction, I think this is where it gets interesting, could also indicate a higher truth, however understood, a spiritual truth, poetic truth, or philosophical truth. Hence our enjoyment and acceptance of what we call poetic license. So my second question, might we see the architectural project as an instance of poetic license? Poetry for Aristotle was truer than history. Why? Because it discloses human possibilities, which is to say, it shows us what makes us truly human, what we strive for or succumb to. Sometimes one's behaviors are heroic, sometimes rather cowardly. That's the subject matter of fiction. Figure is cognate with figmentum, which means something fabricated or fashioned, sometimes in fact, sometimes in imagination. The latter, a pure product of the mind, intended to justify, explain, or glorify. This is the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the end of the Parkway, designed in the early part of the 20th century, a detail and a construction view. A key associated term in this family is figure. Latin figura meant something shaped, such as these stones, shaped with a chisel, or the shape given, form. Let's say the form of a column you see on the right, which would be apparent in things or to the mind. Figurines, we say in English, are molded in clay. But the wide exfoliation of the term includes prefigure, configure, disfigure, and reconfigure, all at play in the world-making we call architecture. Figures of speech deviate from normal usage, but can be productive, as in metaphor, which I understand to be a form of semantic violence that renews language. Early usage of figura signified outwardly or perceptible form, the Greek word schema. But it also came to mean outline, casually interchanged with profile, which I trust you'll recall was described by Le Corbusier. Profile is the touchstone of architecture. Lastly, an associated set of meanings that matured in a different word family gathers around the word fabricate. Its cognates include fabric, fable, and fancy. The root is the Latin faber, including both the process and the making, the agency. Fabrica was the Latin term for the place of this activity. It meant workshop. Thus, fabricate meant making with one's hands, building, or forging. Fancy, a related word, indicates unlicensed imagination, conveying a sense of unreality. Short of that, fabricate, which I'll use quite a bit in the comments that follow, fabricate can simply mean made up with artifice of some sort, which may or may not intend deception or deliberate falsehood. Joseph Rickword seems to have had the productive meaning of fabricate in mind when drafting his famous title, The Necessity of Artifice. An important convergence derives from fable, which comes from fabular, a fiction, narrative, or tale, with its Latin stem, fare, to speak, say, or tell. Tom's Richards Medical Center in Philadelphia. The interplay of these terms and meanings, fiction, fabricate, figure, varies historically and, as you'd guess, is rather complex. As a result, their use in discussions of built works and projects is very wide. My limited aim is to show the interrelationships between the several ways that buildings, gardens, and streets are fabricated. In other words, the art of making buildings is the art of making fictions. Dimensions of achronicity will be exposed. As Aristotle suggested, it is subordination of history to poetry. This may be controversial, I trust it will be, I'll probably be criticized for it, because much of our intellectual effort these days is to historicize our subjects, and thereby understand them. In an attempt to make a clear presentation, I'll describe three kinds of fiction in the art of architecture. All my cases will come from Philadelphia, where I happen to live. After this first longish part of my talk, I'll turn to the matter of time, the time of fabrication, as I've described it, projects in time of time. So first, fictions in architecture, survey drawings. Most architectural projects begin with a site survey. Even when maps are available, architects still visit sites to make sense of given conditions, as did Le Corbusier, the sloped row location that La Tourette was to occupy. He wrote, "I had come here, I took my sketchbook as usual, I drew the road, drew the horizons, set the orientation of the sun, I sniffed out the topography." Ernesto Nathan Rogers also invoked investigative eyes, hands, and his nose in the approach he recommended to pre-existing conditions. Ambientale, he called them. Though on-site drawings and photos serve the interest and show the mannerisms of the architectural detective who made them, they are also useful to others who will take part in the project. Here's a ratio I think is significant for students to think through. What the actual location is to construction, the drawn survey is to design. Insofar as the aim is to catch what is particular to a place, a significant degree of objectivity is intended, retaining key aspects of what presents itself as itself, or is proper to the location. On the right, Alvaro Siza doing the drawing on the left for an installation at the Cistercian monastery in southern France at La Tournai. Surveys do not intend point-by-point replicas. That would be impossible, and I don't think any architect would want it anyway. The task is not to reproduce, but to reduce. To see more by focusing on less. I mean those aspects of a place that are pertinent to the project. We typically refer to the subject matter of these views as given. But surely survey work is also supplementary. It shows what no one previously suspected was there. In other words, drawings of this kind show what is not given. This can be said otherwise by observing that the subject matter of site description and interpretation has no date. In a sense, Kahn's drawing, the first time he visited the site at Salt, Kahn's drawing could be characterized as prehistoric. Projects begin with precisely this dimension of places, which is perforce both a discovery and an invention. So in keeping with the strict meaning of terms, one can say surveys are architecture's first fictions. Before any bricks are laid or concrete cast, the architect's work is already productive. I mean to say the site is shaped on the page, and that's the site of the project, the page. Kahn was very clear about the fictive quality of a project's first phase, the phase I call the beginning of the beginning. In 1931, he insisted there is no value to exact imitation, were that even possible. If one's intention is to create, mirroring what is ostensibly given is pointless. Quote, "I try in all my sketching not to be entirely subservient to my subject, but I do have respect for it and regard it as something tangible, alive, from which I extract my feelings." The question this explanation raises concerns the requirements for Kahn's, I'll call it disobedient deference. His answer was plain, quote, "We must learn to see things for ourselves. So a preliminary to this preliminary is breaking the habit of seeing only what one has expected to see or others have observed. We commonly say views are taken and images are made. On-site drawing, however, is neither an abbreviation nor shadow of some otherwise full reality. I'd characterize it as a creative reanimation of what had been seen, fashioned anew, and therefore fictive. To explore this thesis, let's imagine Kahn at the site of a large urban project in Philadelphia, the unrealized triangle plan on which he worked between 46 and 1950, in collaboration with Oskar Stoneroff. The complex urban topography of the multi-block site gave Kahn a wide range of possible vantage points for what Corbusier called sniffing around. He could take his stand within the tangle of closely packed streets, alleys, yards in the area's residential core, or he could view it from wide avenues that edged the site, or facing the stacked levels of the river's edge, or again, on one of the bridges that passed over the river. With his pencil-fisted hand, paralleling the page, stationed at a perch of his choice, his eyes searched depths, spanned clearings, and gauged vertical changes. I'd like to say shaping by sighting and fabricating views that characterize the place. I've noted that we tend to think of survey drawings as a takeaway from what is already there, derived from direct perception and dedicated to physical things, houses, monuments, train stations, rivers, that are variously configured, dimensioned, and spread out from near to far. That's not untrue, but I think incomplete and inexact. Each of Kahn's views was taken from a standpoint that he decided, with an optic particular to his manner of remaking. This is to say, a degree of subjectivity is required in every survey, notwithstanding the hard and unavoidable requirement for the correct degree of objectivity. A close look at the configurations and profiles that appear on his drawings, I think, will help us grasp the nature of his fictions more clearly. Kahn's survey from across the corner of Cuthbert and 20th Street has a clear focal point, the slender tower of City Hall, the only building given surface articulation and shadow. Less apparent in the drawing, but no less important to Kahn, was the PSFS building, here shown behind the tower, designed by George Howe and William Lescaz, about whom we heard earlier today. The other figures are rendered in outline only, some given side walls, others merely a frontal plane. The result is a shallow, insubstantial backdrop for the diagonal that accelerates through the middle ground, Filford Street Viaduct, otherwise known then, no longer now, as the Chinese Wall, because it divided this part of the city into sharply contrasting halves. The absence of depth in the distance is complemented by a flattening of foreground figures. Also striking, I think, is the reduction of the viaduct to a surface pattern of arches without intermediate piers. The drawing implies no connections through the arches, though of course there were many. Kahn's survey amounted to this. First, a foreground spread of pavement and street deck, emblems of the city's grid. Then low-lying volumes that are equally wide and impenetrable. Next, an against-the-grain arcuated cut, backed up by shallow depths that collectively form flats at the side of a center stage vertical. In reality, all these buildings have volume, of course, also surface articulation, intermediate distances, and physical presence. But profiles are not attributes of things. They are evidences of one's point of view. Kahn fabricated a landscape that made sense of the place in terms of his optic and the future project's aims, which I'll characterize as increased verticality, wide horizontality, and clear orientation. One of the two rivers that frame Center City, Philadelphia, it's called the Schuylkill, formed an important edge to Kahn's site. The near shoreline barely appears in this second perspective, but there's no doubt it came close to the tips of his shoes. Again, the river is left back blank, while lateral and distant figures populate the scene. Please look at the left. A shaded profile shows the close proximity of nearby buildings, indicating another salient characteristic of the city. Philadelphia has very narrow street widths. Of course, the blackened foreground figure also serves the function as a visual frame, bracketing a view toward the facade of 30th Street Station. But for all its bulk and cubic solidity, the monument has uncertain standing. It's been deprived of a base by right-to-left horizontals that stack local traffic, a crosstown expressway, and below both, the river's edge, which is where the water from the famous waterworks rises and falls with the tides. On the right stands the viaduct. It's not the lace frill we saw in the Cuthbert Street view, but a hefty construction endowed with volume and hollows, standing knee-deep in the river, laboring to support the rail lines that slice the city in two. There's no answer to questions concerning the spaces sheltered in its hollows, but here again, as with the stack of flows, I think Kahn is wondering about the potentials of the city's substrate. In the explanatory text that accompanied later design sketches, which I'll call second fictions, he introduced the term platform to name each of the levels of public space the project would organize. Quote, "The platform must therefore evolve as part of an architectural mechanism of pedestrian concourses, levels for services and parking, promenades for shopping, pleasure and fun, all with towers confined at major transportation centers." Seems to me two survey topics subordinate all the others. Horizontal emblems of lateral flow, compressed into a stratified base, capable of coordinating otherwise discrete objects, in other words, civic monuments. And second, spatial depth within an element of urban infrastructure that had been indifferent to local occupation. In both cases, the river played a key role, but Kahn didn't draw it. This third and the last view I'll show you, taken 180 degrees from the first, looks again toward 30th Street Station, and likewise dedicated to the interplay of levels. But instead of a fairly simple configuration, he constructed a tangle of diagonals, arches, frames, and planes. As before, a foreground spread of street geometry situates the project at the edge of a grid. There's nothing unclear about it, hence its slight visual weight. The arch-supported infrastructure entering from the left knifes across the orthogonals toward a distant monument, here too deprived of footing. The background on the right presents a pattern of facades that have been pressed into service for a backdrop of the interplay of ramps and slopes, struggle to join the upper tracks to the street below and the unseen shore. What this drawing discovers, what the survey found there, is a complementarity between the hefty, though hollowed elements of the infrastructural base and the lightweight frames that hover over the tracks. Other drawings from this and other projects explore still more topics. These three, however, should be sufficient for some preliminary conclusions about what I'm suggesting we might think about as the first fiction in architectural project making. Kahn made the city edge more stratified than it really was. Also, the clearings within the fabric became more disruptive than they actually were. And the city's density became more compact than contemporary photographs show it was. Though the streets and spaces he drew didn't exist in that way there, I think they could have, and surely would not have been found elsewhere. Likewise, the block corners, monuments, infrastructures, and facades. I think it's fair to say he made the city what he understood it to be. Maybe one can say, according to his fancy. His fictional views also disclosed how it could yield to what his project would propose, though I think without being coerced to yield in that way. So our question, I think, should be, does such a fancy have any limits or constraints? Is anything possible? My sense of it is that fabrication that is most useful and plausible is the one that catches what is particular the place as it will have been. Not now, not in the past, but as it will have been. Not only at this moment, but as it is no longer and not yet. There is in English a specific grammatical form for this kind of temporality. We call it future perfect continuous. What a sight will have been. More about it in just a minute. Now my second fiction, designs. If survey drawings are a project's first fiction, design drawings, I think, can be understood as its second. No less fabrications, I'll suggest, maybe more so. Consider the preliminary design sketches for PSFS building at 12th and Market, the tower Kahn included in his survey perspectives. Both architects responsible for the project produced preliminary drawings, variously freehand and ruled. George House before the partnership was formed, and William Lescaz after. For our purposes, authorship, which is one way we tend to value historical buildings, I think authorship is less important than what the sketches show. Specifically, how the building was to combine urban and architectural elements that hadn't been coordinated that way before, constructing an unforeseen but compelling three-dimensional plot. The axonometric drawings are particularly interesting because they show the early conception of the entire building, at least what was apparent from street level upward. In general terms, the body of the building was shown to be three-part, an elaborately stratified base, some levels of which were subsurface, the intermediate block of offices in the T-shaped tower, and the no less elaborate upper part, which would be, in later developments, topped off by the red letters of the famous sign. Of course, the axonometric view presents a figure more for thought than for sight, as it assumes a vantage no one could occupy, but it does show true dimensions and geometries. Already in this sketch, one can see the attempt to overcome a categorical separation between the three key parts of a thin central band that is neither structural nor spatial, and perhaps for that reason didn't survive in the later stages of design development. The discordance between the primary elements was aggravated by the wonderfully creative approach to the lowest level of the three, the building's base, an entirely unprecedented stack of 8 levels. Obviously some below the surface. One task the base had to perform was bringing the tower down to the pavement. Another was fronting 2 streets of unequal urban importance. And a third, the most difficult task, was coupling levels and programs that were typically kept separate. A subsurface concourse and connection to the newly cut subway, here you can think Rockefeller Center, street level entries to the bank and the shops at that level, access to the large size banking hall up the escalator, equipped with massive windows in the final design, a mezzanine balcony, and all the provisions for the institution's financial operations. Such a complex and concurrent set of challenges in literary composition was described by the philosopher Paul Ricoeur as concordant discordance. Much has been said about the novelty and foresight of placing the banking facilities on the building's second floor above street level, reached by a stairway, elevator, and the famous escalator you see here. While unusual and controversial at the time, the solution proved to have great practical advantage, for the ground level was thus freed for retail activities that attracted potential customers to the building and bank, customers who could easily have deposited their dollars and cents elsewhere. I read anecdotally that in the time of the Depression, when the project started, people were allowed to deposit 25 cents in their accounts. The building was finished in '32. Before this time, Philadelphia projects obviously had basements and ground floors, but never had they been synthetically conjoined in this way, never so carefully interwoven with an underground network in the first case, and as the upper horizon of the streetscape in the second. Though the details of this integration are unapparent in the early sketches and even final views, the combinatorial intention is obvious. The most difficult task is to see the result as something other than merely the sum of components. In a letter to the philosopher Paul Weiss, one of the architects, George Howe, defined architecture. It's a beautiful phrase, I think. He said, architecture is the physiognomy of our culture. It's how we see ourselves in permanent form. Through the constitution of such a figure, it was far from simple. It's plain it was not only composite, but I think its parts remain conflictual. But this is true of all good plots, and likewise of good fiction, proposing a unity that really doesn't exist, but we wish it did. Now, my third and last case of fictions, built spaces. Spaces that seek to be what they are plainly not. In the initial survey of the building, their design was to replace Paul Cray's Barnes Museum outside Philadelphia from 1925, you see on the left. The architects Todd Williams and Billy Shen discovered abundant natural light within Cray's early modern interiors. There was also an exceedingly close arrangement of paintings and objects within rooms that were themselves economically packed together. It was so concentrated, the ensemble felt, they thought, everyone thought, it was really claustrophobic, which made the experience of visiting the old barns entirely exhausting. Among the many objectives of their scheme, with its new site and enlarged program, an important one was overcoming, at least reducing, the sense of confinement. I should say, it will help you understand it, if you haven't seen the building, that when Williams and Shen designed the new barns in downtown Philadelphia, they were required to reproduce the hang and the rooms of old barns. So the dimension, the geometry, the color, and the placement of all of the objects had to be remade in the new building. Two schematic drawings drawings express their thinking. First, what had been a gallery in a garden could be remade as a garden in a gallery. Second, this inversion could be accomplished by simply splicing two cuts along the former building's cross walls and insertion of garden light wells. One view you see here, and around the corner from that view. En route, passing this into the next room, and passing that. The effect would be a wonderfully refreshing dilation of the viewer's path, offering welcome breaks from what would otherwise be a little bit too much art. Actually, their plot making involved what I'll call a double splice, not only an addition to the content of the visit, but a change in its primary structure. The route through the site and the gallery would no longer be merely a sequence of spaces and objects, one after another, but a structure of them, one space because of another. I'd call it an ensemble of complementary contraries that in some disclose cumulative sense. In his account of plot structure in tragic drama, Aristotle referred to the alternations between sharply antagonistic conditions as character change or reversal. Just as fortune turns bad or good in drama, passage through the barns is structured through contrasting situations. First, a placid outdoor pool, both out and in. Then a compressed and vertical entry, which leads to a huge, really huge civic room, enclosed on three sides, released on the fourth, succeeded by the intimate interiors you've seen, which themselves alternate with garden light wells. When seen widely, the result is what the architects called a layered landscape. Structured conjunctions of heterogeneous settings mixing together at the scale of the city, the house, and the human body. But the scope was still wider, I think. Comparable to the splice tactic was a method of juxtaposing counterpoints. The barn's placid water basin with Logan Circle fountain, the latter appropriately agitated given the scale of its surroundings and subject matter, the city's three rivers, the sculptures by the elder Calder, incidentally. A pool closer in quality to the one of the barns can be found at the center of the nearby Rodin Museum, you see here. What the barn's pool is to the wider landscape, the garden light wells are to the museum circuit, momentary pauses that both punctuate and structure settings that are equally contrasting and congruent. No longer a serial enumeration of successive incidents, but inhabitable spaces structured as a story. Of course, the connections do not exist in fact, nor do the spaces share the same history, but those details do not prevent them from playing their parts in the story the project, I think, seeks to tell. So now the second part of what I wanted to say tonight, shorter. Given the disruptions of linear time fabricated by these projects, one feels compelled to ask, according to what clock or calendar or chronicle do they play themselves out? In what sort of time do surveys, designs, and constructed spaces come into being, remain, and submit themselves to transformation and to restoration? If not linear time, might it be cyclical time? Alternatively, the time of occasions, or perhaps some other? Here's the question. Does the project begin at the beginning, the survey? Or instead, once an architect has a clear idea about its end, the inhabitable spaces? Or does it begin at a third moment, somewhere in between the two, in the time of design development? And what about the long history of the process of the project, from the quarry to the design, construction, then to a ruin, or perhaps restoration? What about the time of the architect's development? Say Cahn's, Trenton Bathhouse, Fisher House, British Art Center. Is that the time of the project that architects refer back and forward to their work in individual projects? Might it be instead the time of the discipline, the passage from enclosed rooms to those that are rather more open? So my question is, how shall we understand the time of the project if it's neither linear nor sequential? I'm scared to show this, you know it's so much better than me, but I like it so much. Here's a quotation that may be useful to us. No new architecture can arise without modifying what already exists. It's by Gergotti. Modification in this phrasing approximates adaptation, about which we've heard in earlier lectures, but I think can be distinguished from it. The first is a more abstract index of change that tends toward affirmation. The second pursues a goal of increased suitability or better fit. 2 nights ago, that was the subject of the lecture. A setting that's been adapted is more apt. The what already exists of this principle, the priorities I've said architects typically call given conditions, can refer to any of the basic topics of design: the site, and you know its importance here, the program or construction materials. Consider the location. Any work that's to be built must be built somewhere, in some spot that exists prior to the project, the site the client has obtained, the conditions of which will make it variously suitable for the spaces and settings the project intends, needing more or less adaptation. Similarly, construction materials also predate the project. Typically, they're found near the site or as the site, in a warehouse, where they wait for resizing and then assembly. My key point, I think, is that the work on given sites and with existing materials always involves the alternation of subject matter that bears the stamp of the interior, anterior, even if it's so recent a past that it seems contemporary. I don't know if you know this, if you've been to Stockholm, this is by Sigurd Leverens rowing club. Very beautiful project, and I didn't understand how it was made until I went there. I'll show you, it's very simple but very interesting. What exists prior to the project persists through adaptations it proposes. Project development never erases all indications of what made a site or a material suitable for sizing and shaping. Nor would such erasure be desirable, for then the place would be unrecognizable, and there'd be no basis for measuring the project's success. Even if a site's slope is drastically changed, let's say cut into a set of stepping terraces, pre-existing conditions below the surface, maybe geological pressures, hydrological movements, and so on, they will show themselves in time through processes of settlement and erosion. Similarly, When pre-existing materials are cut, shaped, and polished, the properties that define them will still be seen and felt through the new finish. On the right are two images from the stadium in Stockholm for the Olympics, when Leverance was given a commission for the rowing club. He took the wood and used it to build his building, as you see on the left. The sorts of change that result from construction are always significant, but never absolute. Construction finishing continues natural processes, or those of industry. Once is never enough. Refinishing repeats the steps that had been taken on site. Finishing continues processes that preceded it and will continue after construction ends. The same is true for the adaptation of programs of uses. New works can indeed offer new types of accommodation, but these patterns will only be sensible if they're sufficiently familiar to invite appropriation. Let's say if the cafe that now screens sports programs still serves coffee. The continued force of pre-existing additions is especially evident in urban architecture. For the primary topics of design, such as frontality and orientation, are conferred upon the project as much as they result from it. A building's back is where it faces the pre-existing block interior, its front, the main street. Even though these observations may seem to take the wind out of the sails of design innovation, which I've called fabrication, the theses of adaptation and modification are neither a constraint on invention, nor a restriction on divergence, still less a concession to the status quo. They require variation, intending what the site and program are not. And that would be the measure of the project's particularity and productivity. This means the project is something other than both the building and the design, though all three are closely related. What then shall we say is actually the architectural project? Is it a process, an idea, somehow both? One definition, again Bergotti, a critical dialogue with the present and its evidences. Now, the second to last section, the prospect of project making. And I'll show you just a handful of images of a building I like very much in Kyoto. It's by Tadao Ando, times 1, 2. He also built a third part of it. Projection, which I take to be the real core of project making, is decisive. Similar to probability in scientific discourse, projection in architecture remains within the limits of the likely. The basic idea here is that architecture, designed and built, never offers more than conditions under which something is likely to occur. I mean, more than a possibility, a possible fiction, but less than a promise. Although project making is forward-looking, it's never more than a prefiguration of a final product, a foreshadowing of an outcome. Furthermore, its advances are always coupled with delays, even retreats. Before it can anticipate anything final, let alone achieve it, it must redefine its relationship to what exists, partly tearing itself away from the present because its provisions no longer suit current needs, and partly remaining there, for that's where changes must be made and where their effect will be seen. A complete break is refused, adhesions are required. Adaptation as transformation requires this. In every project, and I think every work of preservation, there are prospective and retrospective dimensions. The difficulty for the conventional sense of design development is these dimensions cannot be completely separated. They always overlap and intersect. It could be said that design development of this kind has a sort of blind logic that unfolds during, not before the project, detouring after advancing, turning back, renewing beginnings by rethinking premises. And I have Kahn's process in mind here. Paul Klee once described drawing as letting a line go for a walk, moving freely without a goal, a walk for the walk's sake. But if allowed a goal, the ramble he had in mind, maybe one could think of Starbuck, the ramble he had in mind illustrates the path of a project very well. Forward-looking, but open to the attractions of unforeseen encounters, as well as their distractions. Maybe project making in this sense could be described as a mixture of chance and reason. Chances must be taken because repetitions get us nowhere, but reason must intervene because the problems with which we began have not yet been solved. The games people play would lack structure and never develop momentum if the players didn't know with reasonable certainty the outcomes of certain moves. But at the same time, games would fail to excite if foresight could be extended indefinitely. Kahn, the Dominican Sisters project in Philadelphia, never finished, despite the couple hundred designs he developed. Projects, I think, play with circumstances and are played by them. In his last text, Corbusier said this was key, to play the game. The processes of project making are less a matter of foresight and calculation than of cunning, requiring wide-eyed alertness to possibilities as they emerge. Allison and Peter Smithson had a good term for this intelligence. They called it wit plus eye. Constructed space condenses time. Project making depends on this condensation and results in it. It's just as true for adaptations to neighboring buildings, streets, and gardens as for their domestic settings. This happens to be Los's apartment. I mean, the built world as a whole bears witness to patterns of inhabitation. The building's physical body has stories to tell, narratives of construction and reconstruction, the chapters of which do not end until the building falls to ruin, and in some cases, not even then. Maybe you see the outcome of thousands of anonymous individuals remaking the project over time. No matter what the scope of these evidences of the past, project making refigures what had been prefigured. So now my last section, I call it Now Then. Just some images from one of the projects of Wangshu. This happens to be the Ningbo Museum. Considering the projects, as I've tried to describe it, retrospective and prospective dimensions, I think its time can be summarized in a single term. Now then. I don't know if you have this in Portuguese. For us, it means it's a conjunction that's somewhat outrageous from the objective point of view. It's summary understanding while inaugurating action. Now plus then. Now then. It's the instant a decision is made, which involves resolve, buttressed by a conclusion and a beginning. Self-definition now includes another period then, without ceasing to be itself. Can we really say we have a single moment of time when we use this little conjunction? If not, which is what I suppose, if no single moment of decision-making within project development is divisible from those that preceded and will follow, the common conception of time as a succession of nows must be replaced by another form of understanding. On this account, each moment is not bounded, but co-constituted by anticipations and recollections. This is not an English word, but I like it anyway. Interlapsing was set forth by T.S. Eliot in Burnt Norton. I'll use it to summarize what I've tried to say about the time of projects. He wrote, "Footfalls echo in the memory. Down the passage we did not take. Toward the door we never opened, and into the garden." So in project making, as in Eliot's Garden Walk, each project is enmeshed in a temporal field, the limits of which never free themselves from the spectrum of which they're part, nor do they exist as moments unto themselves. Projective thinking is not a possible approach to architecture, but the only one that's true to its phenomenal reality. Moments do not flow in the architectural project. Its instants or phases are not successive. Time abides, time lingers, maintaining some of what caused it to be, while it looks forward to its alteration. The result of such a conjunction is what I've called time out of time, which when made manifest concretely in a work is what we typically describe as something that's beautiful. The now of the project is indivisible from its past and future, both across the margins of the present, including in its currency, times just before and not quite yet. Every once was is by means of the project a might yet be. Of course, that might yet be is always, essentially, and importantly, a fiction. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I like the bit about anticipations and recollections. Can we ask more of that?
Well, I suppose in my reply to your question, I can anticipate where we'll disagree. I'm trying to thicken time for, I have no complaint about calendar and chronicle and clock time. I think we live within them. All I'm trying to say is that in experiences of things that are beautiful and experiences where you understand the logic of a project, there's a condensation of the no longer and not yet into what we call that moment. So to put this in terms of this conference, what I mean to say is that preservation work is a restoration of that thicker temporality that makes a work beautiful. It's not an affirmation of what has been. It's concurrently a projection into what ought to be, as best as we can see it. And that condition, not yet and no longer now, I've tried to say, is something fictional. It's an object of desire. that we variously achieve. So this sense of recall and anticipation, this memory and desire, to put it in human and emotional terms, in the project has to do with the continuity of things that remain pertinent and the supplementation of those remains with something that will make it adequate to what we look forward to. Those are the anticipations. And I believe we should begin to think of this conjunction that is, objectively speaking, impossible as what projects seek to stabilize. I don't know if I've made it any clearer.
Well, you can tell us some of the buildings that you think fit that condition. You can tell us some of the buildings some of the modern buildings that you thinks that fit that condition, and other buildings than those that you've seen.
I don't think what I'm saying is so hard.
No, I'm
It's not
not.
hard to find. I think I'm trying to, you gave me this difficult task of the past to the future and the future of the past. This conjunction is what I think we seek to do with all acts of maintenance and of preservation and of renewal. So the details I've just shown, this last funny one, which is in an England manor house, where over time the steps were so deeply dished, they just said, stuff it, let's begin again. And for me, this is, it is testimony, nonverbal testimony, but it works both ways. Now there's a confidence that you can get up the stairway, but it's that same stairway that our family has known for generations. And this condensation of the project and the recollection, I think is very beautiful in that, even though it's vernacular and has no name. I happen to like it.
Some weeks ago, I was asked to write something for a book that a friend of mine is doing. He's a well-known architect in his 80s, and he has time enough now to go back to his drawings. And he's not only looking to his drawings, but all the people that make these preliminary drawings. And it wasn't clear what the book was about. So we met several times. I said, well, this point where you don't know, you don't know, but you have some kind of intuition. This moment where you are not really have any clear idea, but you begin to understand. And he was interested in this moment of the project. So somehow he's finding in these drawings, which are left behind afterwards, some kind of magic moment that he describes as intuition, because he
Accretion?
eh?
Accretion?
Intuition.
Oh, intuition.
Yes, he describes as intuition. So your presentation brought me back to this problem he has, because it's not very clear what he's looking for, but he's looking into these previous drawings.
Yeah, I oscillated between the time on the architect's drawing board and the time of the work in the world. I could have made it clearer, but I thought that would take too much time. I feel confident that a person at work on a page that is her or his understanding of the place of the project embarks on the effort to bring into coherence things that are previously unrelated. That's design, consolidation of the several requirements. And you have a hunch, you try this, and you think, no. So you step back. And this forward and back is a kind of looking that I thought maybe this funny line from Paul Klee would help with. But that's certainly the way Kahn described the projects I've shown you. And he actually uses the word intuition, that it's not unreasonable, but it's not the form of reason that assumes and projects transparency. It's as much reason in his hands and eyes as it is in something that could be described verbally. And this sense of what's more likely than the other path that you had thought you'd follow on the page, he calls that intuitive grasp. So I think that might help us with what I suppose tried to characterize as the epistemology and temporality of project development. What I'm suggesting here in this conference is that our understanding of preservation is analogous, that there is the time of the project as a palpable realization that is similarly, if you will, intuitive insofar as what has been built points toward a possible future, but only the future will discern in that past the sense it could make. I haven't made this as an argument tonight, but it's what I took for granted as a possible line of thinking to somehow resituate both the architect's work and the life of the building in another temporality, which I believe is true to the title of this conference, The Future's Past. And I think we can only begin to think that through clearly by saying, let's suspend for a moment serial time. And that's what he's asking about with anticipations and recollections collapsing into one another. And I believe that's what happens in good preservation work. Its projected quality is no less important than its preservationist intention. It needs to be perfect if it's to live in the future. So it's a temporalization of both the project and the process of making the project. Does that help at all? What else?
I'd like to thank for the lecture. It was very beautiful, and the poetical approach to architecture was so sensible, and to understand, first of all, architecture as an art and the architect as a poet. In a way, the process of architecture making, what I got it from all that was said, that is, in a way, an act of love. It recalled me a little bit the movie from Carol Reed about Michelangelo's life, agony and ecstasy, talking about this the process of suffering and this time that does not exist to the artist. So when we focus architecture in this way, that we need to see things in another way or transform the world. Now I'm getting a quote from Jeffrey Scott that Lina Bobardis uses at her thesis, that he says, the man, he may construct and transform the world as it is to the world as he would have had it. And I think it's a little bit similar to how you introduced in the beginning, using what would have been, right? Yes. So I just want to thank and say I enjoyed it a lot. Okay, and I think it's I'm also a teacher, and I think that for the students this poetical approach is very it's necessary, right? We need to instigate on them this view.
speaking grammatically, we have in English this jump case that you do in Portuguese. And as if, this is always at the center of projects, as if. But if we can subtend that projective sense of if to what will have been, then I think we have a much more grounded sense of invention. It's as if it will have been that way.
Yes.
And that requires a willingness to let go of the certainties of the object. And it's actually the potentialities that you intuit that propel the project, as much as knowledge. I'm not devaluing knowledge or reason. I'm saying they need to be complemented by unreason.
Like wit and
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
That's
what you
it.
said that moment,
Yeah,
right?
that's Allison
Yeah.
and Peter Smith. And about the Amor Mundi, I happen to agree. When Hannah Arendt, who was mentioned earlier, was asked why did you devote your entire life to political philosophy? She said it's simple, Amor Mundi, I'm in love with the world.
It's beautiful.
Fair enough for an architect.
Great. Thank you.
Well, I would say that this is a fitting conclusion for the day. And so perhaps we call it a day. Thank David again, and leave in the anticipation and recollection of it.
Bravo.